this is now. And what I'm studying is fair trade as a practice which somehow put ethic in business, but I'm trying to analyze how it's done and how the different way fair trade is done can take to different results in a very empirical way. So first of all, I would like to define what is fair trade. This is the definition that has been done in 2001 by all the main fair trade organizations in Europe altogether. And they said that basically fair trade is a trading partnership based on dialogue, transparency and respect that seeks greater equity in the international trade, and it contributes to sustainable development by offering better trading conditions to and securing the rights of marginalized producers and workers, especially in the South. So it's international trade. It's an international trade with some kind of ethical issue that try to apply a better deal for producers. Practically what the main criteria that fair trade does is a fair prices, so to guarantee basic prices, safe for too high oscillation of the market. If the market price on some kind of good go too low, fair trade always try to guarantee a base amount of money to the producer, so they then don't get, at least they can get what they spend to produce and something more to survive and so on. They work on pre-financing. There is the idea of giving also financial resources to producers in order to avoid the credit that in countries in South America, etc., can be really tricky issue. And then they try to offer long-term contracts and work and environmental standards in order to guarantee that also the environment and the quality of work of producers is guaranteed. How it developed, the origins. The first fair trade were some kind of organization which were already dealing with international cooperation, missionaries, NGOs and so on. They started to transform themselves in trading organization because they understood that basically producers were producing something and they could sell it. And what they try to do is to offer them a way to trade their products in a way that was the weaker ring of the chain, which a producer could have a better deal. Passing time, this leader organization grew up and organizing some kind of really enterprises in a way, with very specific characteristics, which as we have GEPA, which is pretty famous here in Germany, or El Puente, another one, or Altro Mercato and Libero Mondo, which are two very representative Italian organizations. And they create an alternative trade chain, which is a parallel way of trading compared with the traditional market activity. This kind of organization are called sometimes fair trade organization, and I prefer to call them ATO, Alternative Trade Organization, which is the first name that they give themselves in the beginning in the 80s when they started to operate and to identify themselves. And it put an accent on the alternativity of and now we will see why. Because in the 90s, in the moment that there was somebody started to think, well, fair trade is a nice thing, how can we sell more fair trade? And then they started to think about and they had an idea, which is supermarket. And this is what they tried to do. So, because the distribution were really problematic, because there are these workshops, Weltladen here in Germany, which try to distribute these fair trade products but are small. There is a small network. And they said, well, if we put fair trade products in the big retailing, we can sell a lot of fair trade. But what does it imply? Imply that in order to do so, you have to insert within the fair trade what are the traditional market actors, corporation, firms, and so on, that they already trade and they already have their product in the shelves of supermarket, and with the attempt to change these products into fair trade. How can it happen? It happened through the idea of a third-party endorsement. Has been created in FLO, the Fair Trade Leveling Organization, which is an organization which sets some standard that enterprises and producers have to respect in order to have a label, which is this label, that can be put on the products, and then the product can go in supermarket, and this is what we pretty often see in supermarket in Germany all around. But this is another way of doing fair trade. They start to activate different dynamic compared to this alternative trade organization that we saw before. And this is the situation that we have nowadays, that we have this label activity, which is the one we just explained, and then we have this alternative trade organization that are united in this World Fair Trade Organization, which is a collective organization of all these kind of specific enterprises. What I do, I analyze this organization as a specific kind of business activity, and I took, well actually more, but in this case we just simplified 4 kinds of this organization, which are GEPA, as we call in Germany, and El Puente, and Alto Mercato e Libero Mondo in Italy. And I try to identify what is characteristic of their way of doing business in order to identify an ideal tip of what they are. And the basic characteristic that we can find in all these organizations, and what are the distinctive points, is that they are non-profit seeking. Of course they have a gain, but they always reinvest the gain in the activity. And there is no paying just for investment of capital, but it's always reinvested. They have democratic structures, because all of these organizations have some kind of, some way to balance the power of the management with association, organization, and some kind of other independent organization which have just social aims, which can control the management and guarantee that the management is really following the social aim of the organization. They seek for financial independence in order not to be stuck in mechanisms of credit that sometimes can be dangerous for this kind of enterprises. And then are a member of this organization, which already saw before, which is the only one up until now recognized as a collective umbrella organization of this kind of ATO, which imply that they have to do fair trade, they are 100% fair trade committed, and they have to respect transparency, they have to account what they do, and everybody who wants to know what they are doing and to control is free to do that. And from that, we move to this idea of an ethical turn in business driven by fair trade. In this, I can already say that there are differences between the 2 ways of doing fair trade. Because if we observe the labeling system and we observe the organization, the firms, normal companies which do fair trade, all of them put fair trade inside their CSR strategy, corporate social responsibility, all these things that a company does in order to behave good for some kind of reason. You can make bio food, you can save dolphins if you are a tuna company, you can be child labor free, you can compensate the CO2 that you produce during their activity, or you can also make fair trade. Now I have a video that is pretty interesting because it's a video from Nestlé, which they explain what they do.